On Christmas Eve, my brother pushed me down the stairs. My leg snapped. My parents laughed. No one ran. No one asked if I was okay. If you think the fall was the worst thing that happened that night, keep listening. The fall was just the part you could see. The real part, they never thought I was clear-headed enough to record. At Christmas, my brother shoved me down the stairs. My leg snapped before I could scream. My parents laughed. Not loud. Just that sharp exhale people make when something mildly inconvenient happens. Like a fly near their drink. I landed 3 steps from the bottom. Wrong angle, wrong sound. The pain came second. I didn't scream. Not because I was brave, just trained. In this house, pain was seen as performance. And I wasn't in the mood to be accused of acting. Brandon leaned on the railing like I'd tripped over my own existence. "Oops," he said, yawning. Diane sighed. "Emily, if you're going to make a scene, do it quietly." Liam giggled. 10 out of 10 landing. Richard never looked up. Eyes on the TV, hand on his glass. No one moved. So I did. I dragged myself up the stairs with 1 good leg and 2 elbows. Brandon didn't help. He shifted just enough to let me pass like I was blocking the sidewalk. At the top, I turned left. My door, my room, my lock. I sat still. Then I packed. Laptop, charger, wallet, deodorant, hoodie, passport, a folder labeled receipts. It held more than receipts. My leg throbbed, but I avoided the medicine cabinet. Hoodie, socks, 1 pair of jeans, no hesitation. I booked a room, called the Uber. 5 minutes. Outside, the snow looked untouched, like a blank page. I didn't say goodbye. Diane asked where I was going. I didn't answer. She didn't insist. The door shut behind me like it had chosen me. The Uber driver looked at my leg. "Want the ER?" I said. "Not yet." We drove through the city like someone was erasing everything in neon. The motel was already booked. Room 217. Cash. No questions. I dropped the bag. Sat on the bed. Opened the laptop. 1 file. Wide angle. Clear audio. Brandon pushing. Me falling. Diane sighing. Richard watching. Liam laughing. I didn't press play. I didn't need to. That video wasn't the beginning. It was the middle. Because if I start this story at the fall, you'll think it was sudden, that it came from nowhere. But it didn't. This wasn't chaos. It was pattern. It was crescendo. It was the answer to a question they didn't know I'd been asking for years. So no, this didn't start at Christmas. Let me rewind. Silence wasn't new. But this time, it didn't mean danger. It meant I was finally alone on purpose. The motel room smelled like bleach and regret. Thin carpet, flickering lamp, a bedspread that tried to be cheerful, but didn't try very hard. I didn't care. I didn't need comfort. I needed quiet. I dropped my bag beside the bed and sat down slowly, testing how much weight my leg could take. Not much. Pain flared sharp and personal like a secret only I was allowed to feel. I didn't wince. I didn't groan. Pain was old news. I leaned back until my shoulders met the headboard. Stared at the ceiling. Yellow paint. 1 dead fly stuck in the corner. No sound except the hum of the heater and my own breath. I checked my phone. 0 messages. 0 missed calls. Not even from Liam. Especially not from Diane. No one was looking for me. Which made sense. I had never really been there to begin with. Not in the way that mattered. People notice when something important disappears. Not when a background object slips out the back door. I closed my eyes for exactly 3 minutes. Then I opened my laptop. The screen lit up too bright in the dark. 1 folder. Labeled Deck 25 Footage. Inside a single video. Time-stamped. 17 seconds long. I hovered the cursor over the file. Didn't click. I already knew what it showed. I could replay it in my mind with better resolution than the camera ever caught. Brandon at the top of the stairs, me with the napkins, his words, his hands, my fall, the sound, the laughter, my mother's voice, my father's silence, Liam's laugh track. I didn't need to see it again. Not yet. I closed the laptop, let it rest beside me like a weight I had chosen to carry. I leaned my head against the wall and stared straight ahead. There was a mirror across from the bed. I could see myself, just a shape, not a person, not yet. I was 10. Brandon was 13. He'd slammed my head against the stair railing because I touched his video game. There was no blood, just dizziness and a swelling I felt under my hair. I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom for hours, sat in the tub with my knees pulled up, trying to slow my breathing. The door was thin. I could hear everything. Diane outside on the phone with someone, I think it was Aunt Rachel. She said Emily's being dramatic again. I don't know what's wrong with that girl. She always has to make herself the victim. She said it casually, like she was describing the weather. That sentence lodged somewhere inside me. I didn't come out until midnight. No one had knocked in hours. I had cleaned the blood from under my hair with tissue, thrown it in the toilet, flushed it away. In the mirror, I had looked at my own face and whispered, "Don't give them anything they can use." It became a rule, a mantra, a kind of armor. So now at 23 in room 217, the armor still held. I didn't cry. I didn't reach out. I didn't call for help. The heater clicked again. The room was small, silent, safe. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't mean danger. It meant I was alone, on purpose, and that made all the difference. The bruises didn't start with fists. They started with blame. I was 7 when I learned how to disappear without leaving. I was 7 when my brother strangled my doll and called it justice. He didn't even break eye contact, just pulled the shoelace tighter until the plastic cracked, then stuffed it into my backpack like a trophy. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't have to. The teacher found it during math and said my name like I was dangerous. I tried to explain. I got 4 words out. It wasn't me before my mother appeared in the doorway, smiling like this was a school play. "Brandon's just creative," she said. "He was playing detective." The class laughed. I got a warning. He got admiration. At home, my father told me to apologize. "You embarrassed your brother. Don't drag him down." That night, I stared at the ceiling and tried to memorize the silence. A week later, he punched me hard enough to bruise my eye because I changed the channel. It was a Tuesday. Picture day. Diane handed me her sunglasses, designer ones. "Tell them you have light sensitivity," she said, like it was normal to rehearse lies. That was the script, his stress, his promise, his future. I was background, a shadow to absorb the heat. No one asked what I needed. Not Diane, not Richard, not even the teachers. Except one Miss Thompson, a substitute, who didn't know the rules yet. She saw me flinch when another boy raised his hand too fast. She pulled me aside, whispered, "Does someone at home hurt you?" I wasn't planning to answer. But my body was tired of holding everything. "My brother hurts me sometimes," I said. She didn't gasp, just nodded, said I was brave, promised help. That night Richard sat at the foot of my bed. His voice was quiet, calculated disappointment. "If you ruin your brother's future, we'll never forgive you. Do you want to make your mother cry?" I nodded. That was it. No more truth. I learned how to stay quiet, how to fold pain small enough to hide, how to disappear inside a house I never felt safe in. They trained me well, rewarded silence, punished exposure. Brandon hit harder when no one believed me. Diane defended louder when they could see the bruise. Richard's silence always landed worst. My body became something quiet. My mind became a filing cabinet, The doll, the slap, the warning slip, the sunglasses, the whisper, the unspoken threat. So when I fell down the stairs and didn't scream, it wasn't strength. It was habit. It was rehearsal. I already knew the lines they'd use. She slipped. She's dramatic. She wants attention. That script wasn't written at Christmas. It was written when I was 7. Brandon wore a crown no one could see, but everyone bowed to it. When he failed math, Diane blamed the teacher. When he forgot Liam at soccer, Richard said boys were forgetful. When he dented the car, they said he was stressed. Every mistake he made was growth. Every mistake I made was a flaw. I cooked dinner standing on a stool, packed Liam's lunches, washed Brandon's sheets when he wet the bed at 14. No thanks. No allowance. No questions. When I asked why he couldn't do it, Diane said, "You're a girl. Be proud to take care of your family." I wasn't proud. I was exhausted. My life was a loop of chores and silence. One night Brandon vomited all over the hallway carpet. Diane shook me awake. "Clean it." I asked if he was okay. She snapped, "Focus on the carpet, not the drama." When I said he could clean it himself, she glared. "He's sleeping. He has school. So did I." Didn't matter. His future had bodyguards. Mine wasn't even on the list. On my 16th birthday, there was no cake. Diane forgot. When I reminded her, she said, "You're too old for that stuff." 3 weeks later, for Brandon's birthday, she rented a band and catered steak for 15 people. I served drinks. Someone took a picture. I was blurry, half out of frame, holding a tray. It felt honest. The only person who ever really saw me was Grandma. She asked questions like, "Are you okay?" She noticed when I was quiet. She noticed when Brandon never helped. She noticed everything Diane didn't want noticed. So they sent her away. Memory issues, they said. But it wasn't forgetting that made her dangerous. It was remembering. The week before she left, she handed me an envelope. "If something ever feels wrong and no one believes you, this might help." Inside was a copy of her will. Clause 14 underlined in red. I didn't understand it, but I hid it beneath the loose tile under my bed. The last time I saw her, she was in a wheelchair staring out the window. She didn't speak. Maybe she didn't recognize me. Or maybe she did, and knew I'd already started fading. After that, no visits, no updates, just paperwork. Then a date. The funeral. I didn't cry. I just packed the black coat I hadn't worn since they moved her out. Grief doesn't always sit in the loudest seat. Sometimes it's the one left untouched. The one no one thinks to set. Christmas came with its usual choreography roast. In the oven, napkins, folded forks, left knives right. I moved through it all like a stagehand no one thanked. 12 settings. One chair left empty. Not by design. Just because no one thought of it. Grandma's seat. Still pushed in. Still silent. I stood behind it for a long time, fingers resting on the wood. No one looked. Diane checked the timer. Richard opened wine. Brandon turned up the TV. Liam asked if we had gravy. I sat down, smiled on cue, laughed where expected. When Diane asked if I was cold, I shook my head. I wasn't cold, just hollow. Somewhere between the soup and dessert, Brandon tossed a crumpled napkin. It hit my glass. Water spilled. Diane gasped. "Emily, be careful." I cleaned in silence. Not because I agreed, but because the story had already been written. I cleared plates, refilled drinks. No one noticed I hadn't eaten. The only person who ever asked if I was tired wasn't there. Her chair stayed untouched. Her name unspoken. At one point, Richard raised a toast to family. Everyone clinked glasses. I did too, because habit is stronger than truth. I looked at her chair. Imagined what she might have said. Maybe nothing. Maybe just, "I see you." That was what I missed most. Not protection, just presence. After dinner, I took a peppermint from the bowl by the stairs. It used to mean scolding. Now it was just flavor. Diane called from the kitchen asking if I'd wipe the counters. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch. Let it fill the room like breath. Then I turned, said, "In a minute," and meant it. They said she was confused, but she was the only one who ever saw things clearly, and that made her dangerous. The rain didn't fall, it slashed. Sideways and mean, like it had a personal grudge. I stood at the edge of the burial plot in a black coat that wasn't mine and shoes that soaked through by the second hymn. Diane held a white umbrella over herself and Brandon. Richard didn't even pretend. He kept glancing at his watch like he had a meeting after this. The pastor spoke gently, vaguely, like he was reading off a script written for someone else's grandmother. There was no mention of me. Not in the stories, not in the list of surviving relatives, not in the thank yous. Brandon handed out tissues, and Fate cried so convincingly that Diane kissed his temple after. I didn't speak. I didn't approach the casket. I didn't need to. My grief had started long before she stopped breathing. It began the day I came home and she was gone, shipped to a memory facility without warning. I had asked Diane why. She said she's confused. It's better this way. But Grandma wasn't confused. She was dangerous to them. She asked too many questions, noticed too many bruises, hugged me when no one else remembered how. That scared them. So they erased her. And today they buried her like a relic. Pretty box, polished lies. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that she left me something. Not jewelry, not cash. A piece of paper. Folded, handwritten, and slipped into my palm the last time I saw her alone. "Don't open it yet," she said. "But don't lose it." I didn't. I kept it under a loose floorboard in my room, inside an envelope that smelled like lavender. After the funeral, we went to the lawyer's office for the will. The room was gray and dry and smelled like old carpet. The family sat in leather chairs like shareholders. Alan, the lawyer, read the standard lines first. Richard got the bonds. Diane got the antique china. Brandon got a safety deposit box. Liam got books he'd never read. Then came the pause. Alan cleared his throat. "There's one conditional clause." Diane shifted in her seat. "Oh," Alan continued. "If Emily Harper can provide legally verifiable documentation of long-term abuse by family members, she will inherit the family home exclusively." Silence. Then Brandon snorted. "Seriously?" "That's in there," Diane laughed. A real sharp, stinging laugh. She always was dramatic. "Guess she died that way too." Richard didn't laugh. He just said, "That clause won't hold. It's based on fiction." No one looked at me. Not once. As if the possibility of truth didn't deserve eye contact. I said nothing. I didn't flinch. Just watched Alan slide the paper back into the folder like it wasn't fire. I remembered what I had hidden at home. The paper, the clause, the red ink underlining that sentence. I remembered the way Grandma had said, "They'll call it fiction. You make it fact." That night I opened her letter for the first time. My hands didn't shake. The ink was smudged in places, but still readable. It said, "If they ever make you feel like your pain is imagined, this paper says it's not. If they erase you, this writes you back in. If they silence you, this gives you something louder." I didn't cry. I folded the paper exactly the same way and placed it back under the floorboard. I lay down and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the storm kept going. The house creaked. No one came to check on me. Brandon played music too loud. Diane ordered takeout. Richard watched TV. And I listened to the sound of their voices bouncing through walls, thinking they'd won again. They hadn't. They didn't know I had the clause. They didn't know I had the letter. And they didn't know I had started recording weeks ago. The overhead camera in the hallway was still running. The footage of Christmas Eve. The sound of my leg breaking. Diane's voice saying, "Don't be dramatic." That was all still there. Waiting. Just like I was. Quietly. Patiently. The kitchen clock clicked louder than usual. I had been standing for nearly 3 hours, not counting prep the night before. The roast was resting. The potatoes were whipped to a silk texture. The rolls were warm under a towel. The napkins were folded into triangles, just like Grandma used to do, with a soft crease down the middle that made them look like they were trying to hold something in. I set the table, 5 plates, 5 sets of silverware, 5 glasses. I paused, looked at the chairs, counted again. 5. Diane, Richard, Brandon, Liam, and the neighbor who always dropped in uninvited but was still counted. I picked up the 6th chair out of habit. Then I stopped. I stared at it. It didn't belong. I carried it back to the corner and pressed it against the wall. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't about space. It just didn't make sense to include myself. No one would notice the chair was gone. No one would ask where I was supposed to sit. They never had. I wiped a fingerprint off the glass, adjusted a spoon so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the placemat. Then I stepped back and looked at the table like it was a display in a museum, polished, symmetrical, lifeless. The house smelled like butter and thyme, like something warm was about to happen, but it never did. Brandon was upstairs playing music, loud enough for the bass to vibrate the walls. Liam was in the hallway mirror taking selfies with my food behind him like a prop. Diane was on the phone with Aunt Rachel, saying how exhausting it was to do it all herself this year. I moved like background. I handed out plates, refilled drinks, smiled automatically when Liam lifted his phone toward my face, then turned before the click. I made a plate and left it on the counter. Said I'd eat later. I lied. I went upstairs instead. My hands were steady, but my chest was hollow. I opened the closet where I kept the candles, stood there longer than needed, just holding them, their cold wax edges pressed into my palms. Maybe they felt heavier than usual. Or maybe I was just tired of pretending I was needed. The flickering box was the only thing in the house that would be lit by my presence. Downstairs, Diane called my name. Not to ask where I was, just to ask if I could bring more forks. Brandon had dropped one. I didn't answer. I stood there remembering the Christmas when I was 14 and made pumpkin soup from scratch because Grandma said it was her favorite. I had peeled every carrot, pureed, every clove of garlic stirred until the consistency was perfect. Diane took one bite and said it tasted cheap. Brandon dumped Tabasco in his bowl and told me I should stop trying to impress people. That was the same year I put up a small fake tree in the hallway. I had decorated it with old beads and paper stars, trying to create something festive. Brandon knocked it over with his gym bag, shattered one of the glass ornaments Grandma had given me, and Diane blamed me for cluttering the space. The tree was gone by morning. The glass was still in the rug a week later. I returned to the dining room slowly. My leg ached from standing. The table was full. Every chair was filled. And even though I had cooked every dish, wiped every plate, made sure the gravy was seasoned and the rolls didn't burn, they were eating without me like I had never existed. Diane was complimenting Brandon's shirt. Liam was scrolling while chewing. Richard poured himself more wine. No one noticed I was standing. I placed the candles at the center of the table. Diane told me to blow one out because it was too bright. I nodded, tilted the wick slightly, then stood still again. My name wasn't mentioned once. Not in the thank yous, not in the conversation. I walked slowly back to the kitchen, pulled the trash bin open, and sat beside it on the tile. It smelled like onion skins and chicken bones and forgotten foil. I leaned my head against the cabinet, listened to the laughter echo from the dining room. Let it wash over me like white noise. I tried to remember the last time someone looked at me at a holiday table and asked how I was doing. Not what I was making, not what I was bringing, just how I was. Maybe Grandma. The last real Christmas we had, she reached for my hand during dessert and said, "Does anyone ever ask if you're okay?" I had smiled and told her yes. We both knew I was lying. but it felt kinder than making her carry the truth. I sat there on the cold tile and let that memory play like a rerun I couldn't stop. Then I realized I had never expected a seat. Not really. I had always known I was setting the table for other people. For the people who counted. The people who were counted. And I had removed myself like a missing puzzle piece that made the picture easier to finish. Not out of anger, out of accuracy, out of habit, out of truth. He didn't yell, didn't rage. Just one hand, one motion. Quiet violence always leaves the deepest break. He didn't say move. He didn't say excuse me. He just stood there at the top of the stairs like he had every right to the air. I held a box of candles in one hand and a lighter in the other. The hallway was narrow. The edge of the carpet was curled the way it always had been. Brandon leaned against the railing, arms crossed, half smirk, like he was enjoying the view. I said nothing, just nodded toward the side. He didn't move. "You always cause problems," he said. Same voice he used when blaming me for his missing keys or a grade he didn't earn, or the stain he left on the couch. It wasn't a statement. It was a verdict. I shifted sideways, tried to step around him. That was my mistake. He didn't punch. He didn't scream. He just placed one hand flat on my shoulder and pushed. Hard enough to mean it. Soft enough to claim it was nothing. My foot missed the first step. Gravity did the rest. The box of candles hit the wall. My body followed. I didn't flail. I didn't cry out. The fall was short but efficient. I landed on my right side, and the sound my leg made was not theatrical. It was biological. Dry, definite. A snap that settled into silence. The silence was the loudest part. No one ran. No one asked if I was okay. I heard the microwave beep from the kitchen. Liam giggled like he was watching a prank show. Diane's voice floated through the hallway. "Emily, stop being dramatic." Brandon walked past me like I was furniture. I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and counted the seconds until the pain started to crawl up my thigh like fire with teeth. I closed my eyes and imagined what the camera above the stairs had captured. The exact angle, the motion, his words, my fall, the sound, the aftermath, the evidence. I had placed that camera 6 weeks ago tucked behind a wall sconce with a fake bulb. Brandon never looked up. Diane never asked about electronics. Richard didn't notice anything unless it made him uncomfortable. I had caught smaller things before. Shouting, shoving, but this was different. This was final. This was proof. Still, I lay there a while. Not because I couldn't move, but because I wanted the image to settle. I wanted to remember the way it felt to be broken and certain at the same time. No more guessing. No more maybe I deserved it. Just the sharp, unshakable clarity of a leg split in two and a house that didn't care. When I did sit up, it was slow. I didn't scream. I didn't ask for help. I crawled to the wall and leaned on it until the room stopped spinning. Then I stood. I took 5 minutes to reach my room, packed a single bag, slipped the flash drive from under the drawer into my coat pocket, called an Uber. No one stopped me. Diane shouted from the kitchen asking if I could take out the trash on my way out. I didn't answer. When the driver pulled up, I limped to the car with one hand on the railing and the other on the wall. My leg throbbed with each step, but I didn't let it show. Pain was old, familiar. What was new was the feeling underneath it. Not rage, not sadness. Something colder, something sharper. A kind of quiet armor. As the car pulled away, I looked back once, not at the house, at the window where the camera pointed. The little blinking light was still on, still recording, still catching what they didn't realize they'd already lost. This time they had made a mistake. This time I wouldn't clean it up. This time they'd left fingerprints. And I had them all. I didn't need justice to shout. I just needed it to record. And this time, the silence had audio. I watched the screen like I didn't trust it, like the file might vanish between blinks, like memory could betray me again. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, my leg wrapped in plaster, my breath steady while my hand hovered over the trackpad. The laptop glowed in the dark, a silent witness to everything I refused to let go. I clicked play. The footage began exactly as I expected, hallway carpet banister shadow, overhead angle. Brandon leaning against the railing, arms crossed, posture relaxed as though he owned gravity. I entered from the right, box of candles in hand, weighted down by ritual and resignation. We didn't speak. Then his voice came calm and bored. "You always cause problems." No inflection, just the verdict. I stepped forward. He stayed. Closed the distance. Then he pushed. Not with rage, but with rote precision, the motion of someone flicking a nuisance. My body fell out of frame. Then I heard it, a snap that wasn't theatrical, just biological. A fracture meeting carpet. My breath catching in my throat but never escaping. Silence finished the sentence. Diane's muted voice drifted from the kitchen. Emily stopped being dramatic. Liam laughed like the world was a sitcom. Brandon turned and walked away. No panic. No reaction. 17 seconds. I paused at the exact frame where my leg bent wrong. No filters. No pity. Just evidence. A small voice whispered, "What if they say it's staged? What if they call me unstable?" I'd heard those stories before. So I watched it again. This time I didn't flinch. I copied the file once. Saved a backup. Then I labeled a folder, nothing elaborate. Just what it was. A record. I stared at the wall afterward. Not thinking. Just aware. Of the quiet. Of the shift. Something inside me had stopped shrinking. I packed the evidence in my bag and hailed a taxi to the hospital. The nurse asked if it was domestic. I said yes. Then handed her the flash drive. She didn't need to watch it. She believed the X-ray. I left with a cast, pain meds, and 2 copies of the diagnosis, blunt force trauma right. Femur fracture, estimated recovery, 8 to 10 weeks. Then I went to the police. Said fewer words than I thought I'd need. Placed the report, the drive, and the medical papers on the counter. "It's all here," I said. The officer flipped through the pages. His face changed at the 3rd photo. He asked if I wanted to file a report. I told him I already had. Another officer joined. The walkie-talkie clicked. They listened. I answered. Name. Date. Incident history. Prior signs. Context. I handed over more documentation, not everything, just enough. He paused when he looked up at me. Not with pity, with respect. Like he saw someone who had done the work. They opened a case. Promised follow-up. I nodded. I didn't wait for more. Then I walked into Alan Fisher's office like I belonged there. I placed the flash drive and will envelope on his desk. The reins still clung to my coat. He didn't rise. Just looked at me. I said, "This is what you were waiting for." He plugged in the drive. Watched the footage without flinching. Not once did he interrupt. When it ended, he leaned back, hand on his chin. "They never imagined you'd fight back." I handed him the diagnosis. He read again, then unfolded Grandma's will. Read the clause out loud. If I could prove long-term abuse, I inherited the house. No debate, no contest. "This is solid," he said. I nodded. "I know. We start now," he continued. "Letters first. Negotiation window. Then escalation. I didn't blink. Let them come." He leaned over his desk, like steadying himself against the weight of what we were about to do. "They'll try to rewrite it all. Turn this into vendetta." "They already did," I said. "I'm just taking the pen back." He reached for a folder with my name, slid it toward me. "Here's where we begin." I took it, placed it in my coat. The cast on my leg brushed the chair as I stood. Alan paused, his hand on the page. "Your grandmother meant every word of that clause. "I know," I said quietly. She wrote me back into the story. He nodded once, didn't speak again. I walked into the rain, let it soak into the cast, let it remind me how alive I was. Not afraid, not broken, just clear. And this time, clarity was enough. They built their safety on silence. She gave me one sentence sharp enough to cut through it. His office smelled like old paper and quiet consequences. I walked in straight from the station, casted leg dragging slightly but my spine tall. Alan didn't rise. He never did. Just nodded to the chair like he was expecting someone else and got me instead. I sat, laid the envelope on his desk. Evidence, it read. Nothing more. He opened it without a word. First the flash drive, then the will, my grandmother's handwriting, clause 14, circled in red like a warning or a gift. His eyes skimmed until they didn't. He stopped. Read aloud slowly. If Emily Harper can provide legally verifiable documentation of long-term abuse by direct family members, she alone will inherit the family home. He looked up. They didn't know this existed. I shook my head. Not until today. He tapped the paper once gently. And you held it this whole time. I didn't nod. I didn't need to. He inserted the drive, pressed play. I didn't watch the video. I watched him. His expression didn't change, not really, but his fingers curled slightly at the moment Brandon's hand left my shoulder. The moment my body left frame. When it ended, he leaned back. Not shaken, just quiet. They never thought you'd fight back, he said. I met his eyes. They thought I wouldn't last long enough to try. He picked up the hospital report I'd included. Read it once. Your leg healing. Good. A pause. Then he placed everything carefully into a drawer labeled Case Evidence. No theatrics. Just precision. He opened the will again. Ran a thumb down the margin where the clause sat like a quiet blade. She wrote this for you, he murmured. She knew no one else would. She saw me, I said, even when I wasn't supposed to be seen. His voice didn't soften, but his posture did. Just slightly. This changes everything. I stood. My cast tapped the wood floor like punctuation. Alan didn't move, didn't offer encouragement or comfort, just reached for the folder with my name and slid it forward. It starts now. No long speech. No outline. Just a shared understanding. I took it, tucked it under my arm. As I turned to leave, he added quietly, "You're not doing this alone." I paused, looked back. I never was. She's still here. In the clause. In the ink. In the fact I'm even standing here. He nodded once, solemn. That was all. The door clicked behind me like something locking into place. Not fear, not revenge, just truth stepping forward. And this time, I had something solid beneath me, something louder than silence. They didn't knock like people who came in peace. The car door slammed like a threat. Rachel froze mid-sip in the kitchen, her eyes flicking toward the window. "Is that?" she began. I nodded. "It's them." Her hand tightened slightly on the teacup. "Do you want me to handle this?" I shook my head. I had waited too long for this to let anyone else speak for me. I stood slowly, using the table for balance, letting the cast on my leg remind me why they were here. When I opened the door, Diane was already mid-performance. "Emily, honey, we've been worried sick." Her voice aimed for warmth, but didn't land. Richard stood behind her arms, stiff at his sides, eyes measuring. Brandon leaned against the porch rail like he was counting the seconds until he could leave. I stayed in the doorway. I didn't invite them in. Diane held up something small. "I found this in the drawer. Your old rag." Remember I remembered? She'd pressed it to my mouth after Brandon smashed my face into the counter and said I shouldn't have provoked him. I took the cloth. The stain was still there. I handed it back. "You should keep it. You're better at rewriting history." Her eyes welled, cueing the tears like a reflex. "We didn't come to fight. We came to heal. But you're tearing this family apart." I looked at her evenly. "No, I'm just done holding it together by myself." Richard stepped forward. "It's been hard on everyone. Brandon didn't mean to stand in my way, or didn't mean to push." His voice faltered. "The angle, the intention, these things get misread. The camera didn't misread anything." Brandon scoffed. "You and your damn camera." Then a voice from behind them, Liam quiet but cracking, said, "But you told me she did it on purpose." Diane flinched. Too late. I stepped forward. "I didn't fall. He pushed me. And I have proof." Brandon snorted. "What grainy footage? Get over it." I looked past him. "That camera's the only thing in that house that's never lied." Diane's tears stopped. Her tone dropped. "You're doing this for the house, aren't you?" "No. I'm doing this because that house is the last place I pretended to belong." Richard's voice rose. "You'd throw away blood over one fall. It wasn't one fall. It was every time you looked away. This one just left a cast." Silence wrapped around us. Rachel stepped behind me, then her hand settling gently on my shoulder. Steady. Present. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Diane clutched the rag like it could rewrite the past. Brandon already had his phone out. Richard looked at me like he expected guilt. I gave him nothing. "I'm not fighting you. I'm finished being quiet. That's different." No one spoke. I closed the door. No slam. Just a clean click. Rachel let out a breath behind me. "You okay?" I looked down at my cast. I felt the weight of her hand still steady on my shoulder. I think this is what okay starts to feel like. No footsteps, no shouts, no one to erase me. The house hadn't changed, but I had. The door clicked shut behind me with a softness that didn't match the weight of what had just ended. I stood in the entryway of the house I had grown up in, the house that had ignored me, bruised me, erased me, and now was finally mine. Not through sentiment, through proof, through fracture, through claws. The silence inside was sharp like something waiting to be named. No voices in the hallway, no footsteps overhead, no Brandon on the stairs, no Diane wiping the counter while rewriting memory. No Richard pretending the world outside the TV didn't exist. Just space. Still and open. I didn't bring boxes. Not yet. I brought only a set of keys, a fresh coat of paint, and the kind of clarity that doesn't need explanation. The living room felt smaller without their presence, but that wasn't a complaint, it was a recalibration. The air wasn't lighter. It was just mine. I walked slowly, letting my cast brush each doorway like a signature. The kitchen smelled like nothing now. No garlic from Diane's overcooked pastas. No hints of Liam's microwaved chaos. Just neutral air and quiet light filtering in from the window Grandma had once cleaned with vinegar and newsprint. I opened the drawer where the rag used to live. Empty. I didn't fill it. Not yet. Let absence have its place. Upstairs, the hallway echoed differently. The sound of my steps didn't flinch. My old room still had the faint lavender wall I'd painted at 14, hoping softness would distract from the bruises. The paint had chipped at the corners. I touched one flake with my thumb and felt nothing. Not sorrow, not nostalgia, just texture. I lay down on the floor. No mattress, no sheets, just wood. The ceiling above was cracked slightly, the same spot I used to stare at when trying to disappear inside my head. Now I stared at it and thought, this is what stillness without fear feels like. Not peace exactly, not yet, but potential. The next day I painted. Not for decoration, but for reclamation. White in the hallway, pale ash in the kitchen. A gray so faint it almost disappeared in the morning light for the dining room. Every brushstroke felt like correction, not of color and of memory. The scent of fresh paint was the only thing strong enough to replace the ghosts. I replaced the curtains. Gosh, not because I hated the old ones, but because I needed to choose something without compromise. Linen, clean, no pattern, no pretense. I didn't invite anyone over. I didn't post pictures. But Rachel came. She always did. She walked through the front door without knocking, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and a silence that knew how to sit beside mine without interrupting it. So she said, looking around, "How does it feel?" I glanced at the candle I had lit on the kitchen table. Not a holiday candle, not a scented one. Just a small, steady flame I chose myself. "Quiet," I said. Then softer, in a good way. She nodded, not as someone who needed more explanation, but as someone who recognized the tone. We sat at the table. No tension, no performance. Just chairs pulled close enough to feel like presence. She didn't ask if I missed them. She didn't ask if I felt strong. She knew those weren't the right questions. Instead, she looked at the window and said, "The light lands differently here now." I looked too. It did. Warmer, still filtered, but not clouded, like the house had stopped holding its breath. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The truth was already in the room. It was in the cast on my leg that didn't ache as much. It was in the drawer that no longer held rags of apology. It was in the echo of the door closing behind people who had always expected me to beg. And it was in the clause, the one she left me. A sentence hidden in legal ink underlined in red. Not just a gift, a permission slip, a map, a way back to myself. I had returned not to remember, but to refuse erasure. And in this silence, finally mine, I heard the beginning of something new. Something I wouldn't have to explain. It didn't sound like victory. It sounded like legacy. Legacy isn't about who remembers your name. It's about writing it down before they erase it. The room was so quiet you could hear the dust shifting in the light. I sat by the window, a cup of cocoa warming my hands. Outside, the snow didn't fall, it lingered. Each flake landing like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Peace didn't come from silence. It came from not being watched after surviving. I didn't think of them not directly. I watched the snow and remembered how identity forms one quiet cut at a time. Like that evening, I sat at the dining table writing my essay while Brandon smashed the toy I had built from scratch. Diane's voice sliced through the tension. "You should be more organized." I looked down at my paper, swallowed what I wanted to say. That memory didn't hurt anymore. It just proved I'd outlived it. Years ago, on this same seat, Grandma once placed her hand on my shoulder. It was my 16th birthday. No cake, no candles. But her voice was low and certain. Someone finally saw. I didn't know what she meant then. I do now. That clause in her will, "You deserve a place to begin again," wasn't sentiment. It was strategy. A map in red ink and quiet defiance. One Christmas, I served the soup I'd made from scratch. Diane took one bite and said it tasted cheap. I still remember that mouthful. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. No praise, no seconds. But that was the first time I fed myself without needing approval. The taste stayed not bitter, just real. Just mine. I set the mug down on the table. My fingertips still held a trace of paint from the new window trim. I remembered the first time I opened that window, breathed in the winter air like proof. That moment taught me reclaiming space isn't about taking back. It's about building forward, one still breath at a time. I don't think about their faces anymore. I think about absence, not as void, but as clarity. I don't need to be remembered. I just need not to be erased. Grandma's ink, her claws, etched that promise into the bones of this house. I read that sentence again, not on paper, but in my memory. Not with grief. Not even with gratitude. Just with calm certainty I have a place to begin again. I stood slowly, walked the hallway where the walls no longer flinched, ran my hand along the white paint. The light fixture no longer cast a shadow of who I was. It simply lit where I stand now. This home isn't perfect, but it's clean. It's quiet. It's mine. At the end of the hall, I caught the faint scent of peppermint from the bowl by the stairs. It used to mean scolding cold hands holidays that hurt. Now it was just scent. No story attached. Just presence. I didn't reach for it. I didn't need to. I was already here. I paused, looked at the room, not to decorate, not to reminisce, just to witness. Legacy to me doesn't mean being honored. It means not being erased. If I were to raise a glass right now just once, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't need to be. It would be quiet, certain, a gesture for no one else but me. To peace, to silence, to finally being heard. Not by them, not by history, but by myself. And that is enough.